hi, and welcome to the first episode of a brand new Triangle Podcast mini-series. This is a one-on-one podcast designed to give listeners an in-depth look into more personalized subjects and a way to get a deeper understanding of our interests and hobbies. Today is going to be James and I, and we'll be delving deep into discussion about writing, being a writer, and James' favorite activity in the world, world building. So, James, how are you doing today, man?
Good, how are you?
Doing good. I'm ready to kind of crack this open because this is something we've been talking about for a long time, and it feels kind of strange because this has always been just like one-on-one between us, but now people are actually going to be able to listen to something that we both love.
Now we have an audience.
Yeah, it's kind of changed a bit because this is something that like we both kind of don't really tell anybody about.
Yes, it's very secretive.
Okay.
So I'm not going to reveal everything. Maybe 14%.
Disclaimer, James has files upon files, and so you're only going to be getting a sliver of the information available. So, James, you claim to be a world builder, but that is encompassed within the title of a writer. Mm-hmm. When did you start writing?
So I started writing... Okay, so I didn't actually write on my own until I was probably 5 or 6. But I did when I was 4. I would have babysitters come over and then my parents, and I would sit them down and then I would tell them a story and then I would have them write it out on paper. And then once they wrote it out, I would draw. And the big thing for me was not just telling the story, but was drawing it. Illustrating was my passion before the story part. So I would get my markers out and then I would draw dinosaurs and Roman soldiers and all sorts of stuff. But it wasn't until I was 7 in 2nd grade. I remember being in class, it was math class, and I had my backpack and like sheets of paper on the floor. And I was so bored. I've never liked math. And I actually got out of my seat, I grabbed the papers, and I actually started like sitting down on the floor. I actually started writing a story. And then I can't remember if the teacher like made me sit back or whatever, but that's the first memory I have of actually like being into writing.
Yeah. See, well, I was kind of living a normal childhood where I just watched Sesame Street all day. James was forcing his babysitters to be a scribe for these crazy adventures he was like composing. Like
they weren't that complex. It was usually a story about a boy named Jack and he was being chased by a T-Rex. Or there was one, this is the oldest book I have still in like physical copy. It's a story of how the dinosaurs like died out because of Noah's flood. Because I always wondered like, why are there no dinosaurs if they all went on the ark? So my story was how they died. And it was actually because of an explosion. Like a nuclear.
So James has been writing Alex Jones conspiracy since the age of 5. So that's kind of a good introduction into like who James is, and like he's had this passion, I guess, even though if you started out as drawing, but you've kind of had this interest forever.
Yeah, storytelling is my favorite thing to do in the world.
Yeah, and that affected me because you showed me your book when you were like 8 years old. You made me sit down and read all 40 pages of it.
Yeah,
it took like 3 hours.
That one was that was the first like real novel, I guess you could say, if you want to call it that I completed. And I remember Caden was probably 6 or 7, and I was 8, and I sat him down and I read them the entire thing.
And then you printed out my own copy for me and signed it and gave it to me.
Yeah. I was quite pretentious.
I still have it in my room somewhere.
Yeah. What was your experience like when I read you that?
I was like, my eyes had been opened because since then I had done nothing like creative ever. Because I hated drawing. I was always horrible at it. So I didn't really have any creative drive. And it was like a component missing from my life. But then when James showed this to me, I was like, I want to go home and I want to write my own story. And I did, and I fell in love with it.
Yeah, and fun fact, Caden's story, which concerned 3 characters. What were their names again?
Catherick, Malcolm, and Draffian.
Yeah, those 3. One day, this was probably 2 or 3 years ago, I still had a copy that he had sent me from when I was 8 or 9 and he was around a year younger. And I looked at the characters and I was like, wow, like these 3 characters are kind of cool. Like I think I want to add them to my world. And at that point, Caden had not continued that story. So without asking for permission, I just inserted them into my story. So yes, I have been influenced by Caden on the other side of that. So
yeah, Jade's ripped me off with no credit.
yeah. At least Caden's crediting me.
So that kind of leads to the point, and that's kind of a good segue to the idea of you added them to your world. Now, James, I think every writer starts off trying to write a whole novel. But then I think you start to branch off and realize that you're stronger in certain suits than others.
Mm-hmm.
Like I find that I lean towards a more poetic side, more than prose. I find poetics a little bit easier to go through than prose.
Mm-hmm.
But James, he really found you found your space in this concept of world building.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's talk about world building a little bit, because that's kind of the theme of this mini series, which it's going to be more than one episode, by the way. But let's kind of give an introduction to the concept of world building itself.
Yeah, so I actually have thought pretty in depth about this, but I found out a pithy way of differentiating world building from writing. If you're just going to sit down and write a novel, let's say it's set in a fantasy world and the king wears royal robes. Because today's royal color is purple, the king would wear royal.
Historically, throughout our reality, our timeline, purple has always been associated with royalty in various cultures. Yeah,
so if you're just a writer, you're not a world builder, and you want to write a king, you're going to have him wear purple.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a world builder, you're going to think, well, why is purple royal? And you'll find out it's because purple is a rare dye. So if you're a world builder, you'll go, okay, well, let's have another color be rare because of some trade dispute or because of some, local barbarians or something that's making the dye hard to obtain. So if you have this color, let's just say scarlet, the color scarlet. The royal color in my world will be that color, not purple, but scarlet, or whatever color I want to make it. So that is the difference between world building. It's like a really shallow, pithy way of looking at it. The difference between world building and writing. For world building, you take everything into consideration. Everything. In the backstories and the context of everything. You don't just take from this world and put it into a book. You take from your own world and put it into a book.
Okay, so it's not so much, it's kind of taking what our perception of reality and then kind of making it your own in your own story, in your own timeline.
By going back to the roots of that thing and then changing it to whatever you want, which will then have a cause and effect all the way to what you started with. And then that's unique now.
There's Tolkien. He did a series of lectures called Tree and Leaf.
Yeah.
And it kind of discusses this idea of being a sub-creator, which is kind of, you are almost assuming this like deity type power, where you're kind of orchestrating your own reality. Now, obviously, that's near impossible to get everything.
And in a way, it sounds twisted, but in a way, you are playing God.
Yeah. But the thing that you have to understand is that it's your own story.
Yeah.
You get to do whatever you want in the story. Now, obviously, some stories are bad, but the whole concept of world building is that you make it your own.
It's a sandbox.
Yeah.
You can do whatever you want.
And so what differentiates between world building and writing is that as a novel, you're kind of writing with this linear plot structure in mind, with these characters, these different scenes. As our world building, it's not so much one linear structure. It's more small.
It's a web.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like small little tidbits of information that just get compiled together.
Yeah.
Over time.
And oftentimes, like with Tolkien, for example, you might have one more outstretched line that kind of overarcs everything else. But maybe like the story of Morgoth and and then later on the Ring. But world building just in character is not necessarily one linear story. It's so much more than that.
Yeah, kind of think of being like a writer trying to write a novel is that it's kind of this singular book, right? You're holding one book in your hand with one story.
Or even one series.
Yeah, one series. As our world building is like putting down that book and then turning a 360 and looking in every direction, and whatever you see is part of that world.
Yeah. George R.R. Martin explained it perfectly, where in just a novel or just like a fairy tale, you have the king, the princess, and the prince. World building asks the question, who was the king's father? Who was the king's grandfather? What was he known for? Who was, it just goes back, and from there you establish an entire world.
Yeah. And within that world, you can have your own novels.
Yes, that's
your own
the thing.
stories.
That's what Tolkien did.
Yeah.
He started as a world builder.
And a lot of people, it's kind of sad they don't realize that. They see Lord of the Rings as this is it.
Mm-hmm.
But in a sense, Lord of the Rings is just about one bad guy
Yeah.
and one hero in one certain time. Sauron, kind of in retrospect, isn't even that bad.
No, Melkor is the worst.
Yeah, people kind of don't. That goes over a lot of people's heads.
I think if Tolkien had to choose between the Silmarillion, which is basically his world building book, or Lord of the Rings, I think he would choose Silmarillion.
Yeah, because that's more of his actual story.
Yeah, and I could be wrong, but that's what I think. Yeah.
But things that Lord of the Rings is easily sold because it's a complete story.
Yeah.
People like that.
And novels and just writing is a much more mainstream form of medium, like a medium to writing in general. Whereas world building, and this is why I love world building, is not as explored. So that way when I meet other world builders, it's really fun. Because then you can find out what they've done and you can share ideas and you can borrow ideas from each other. Now I've learned to ask.
Without just pillaging.
Yeah, don't pillage, just ask. But it's really fun. It's a really fun experience.
Yeah, and I actually haven't gotten into much world building. And this is kind of why I want to do this mini-series, is this is kind of a way of me discovering with you, the listener, as well, what this is, what this means, and kind of how to get it started. Because I always, as a little kid, was like trying to write these novels, right? Trying to write these poems, but never did it cross my mind to compose my own reality, my own story, my own tale, my own legend. Like, that never crossed through my mind. So we kind of, me and you, listener, we kind of get to discover this together. And the captain of the ship is James, for most points.
Yeah, not all of them.
So here's a pretty good question. Can a writer go without world building? Is it a necessity for a good story?
A writer can go writing without being a world builder, but a writer cannot go without world building.
Okay.
And I say that because, let's just say, so The Hunger Games, for example, it's a pretty compelling story, but the world is pretty simple. Like, she's divided into like 12 districts or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's like a post-apocalyptic United States. But comparing it to like Tolkien, The Hunger Games is very, very weak in its world building. However, the story would not work without any world building at all. So the author of The Hunger Games, she's not a world builder. It's pretty obvious. But she had to world build for her story to work.
Yeah, so can you differentiate between the two? Between world building and being a world builder? Yeah,
so every author world builds. It's impossible not to, unless, even if you're writing in a historical setting, there are things you have to change.
Yeah.
So you are world building. But a world builder is someone who does that first and foremost. Before actually writing a story, a world builder will care more about the setting that story takes place in.
Yeah, the modern equivalent to like world building in a sense is kind of like making the background information. And so a lot of people see this as kind of secondary. Like, you have these characters and then you kind of have to fill in the background. Yeah. That's world building. As where a world builder creates this whole entire stage, and then the actual story itself is just a small scene of it.
Yeah, exactly. So every author has to world build, but not every author has to be a world builder.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a good clarification. That kind of gets like a better mental picture of what that actually works. So, should stories be built off world building?
Yeah, and going back to the Hunger Games point, as weak as the world building is, the story wouldn't function if the author had not established a world of her own. The post-apocalyptic nature of that series really does enforce a lot of the character emotions and a lot of the plot. So yes, every story needs ingredients of world building. Yeah.
Yeah, it has to, because otherwise there wouldn't be a story.
Exactly.
I can't even fathom the concept of trying to create a story without like any type of world building.
Yeah, no, and a lot of authors will do world building without really realizing it.
Yeah.
They're going into this cave. The cave is dangerous, maybe because of this. No, you just world built.
Yeah.
Right? Even just in creating a cave. So, but a world builder would have already created that cave and then have the characters go in it. That's the difference.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
So if I ever write a novel, which I probably won't, because I'm an awful novelist, I will, if I ever do, and my characters do go in some sort of cave or go and, cross a mountain, I would have already had that mountain or cave, conceived way before I ever wrote the book.
And stories about it itself, its name, its origin.
Yeah, and things that have happened in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I write stories a lot. I just don't write novels anymore. I gave up a long time ago. Writing a novel is so much harder for me than coming up with a mountain range that cool things have happened in, or maybe nothing. I don't know. It's just like world building just comes more natural to me.
And from what I've studied from a lot of authors, they kind of, I guess not actively, but passively world build before they write a novel. So they have all these ideas and they collect all this information, and then they kind of notice a pattern and then form a story out of that. Yeah. I think it's kind of rare for someone just to like crank out a novel out of absolutely no material.
No, it's pretty rare. Yeah, but they're world building for the novel. I would write a novel for the world that I built. So
and that's exactly what Tolkien did.
Yeah.
And I think also people kind of glorify Tolkien and then this concept of originality. But in a sense, a lot of writing, it's kind of a necessity, but you need to borrow from something.
Yeah, no, Tolkien took a lot from Norse mythology, German mythology. Like a lot of his characters are just actually straight out of the books or the stories of Norse.
The Hobbit is literally about one of the third parts of Beowulf.
Beowulf, yeah. Or like Turin Turambar is based on, I forgot his name. It's like a weird Norse name from a Norse epic, and they actually have the exact same story. Yeah. Not to bag on Tolkien, but people do really look up to him as this. Oh wow, he was so original. Like no world builder is original, and I'll confess that we borrow a lot.
You have to,
but we make it our own. That's the difference. And there are some things that like pop into my head where I'll go, oh, and I don't really know where it came from, and I'll put it in my world. But that's a lot less common than seeing something that inspires me and I want that in my world somehow. And so I'll make it work. So it's not just straight off copying.
In a future episode, we'll have to discuss kind of the very philosophical approach to the concept of how world building, when we create our own little realities, we have to borrow from reality. In a sense, it's impossible to create a completely new...
That gets into metaphysics.
Yeah, so we'll definitely have a future episode just simply on the pure metaphysical like plane of world building. But one last question for today, just to get started off on the series. How does one start world building?
Oh, well, I'll just give a fair warning now. If it's not in you and you have no joy in it, don't do it. Just don't. And that includes you, Caden. If you just can't muster up enough joy while you're world building, then don't do it. Like you literally don't have to. Yeah. You don't have to be a world builder because it is a lot. It requires a lot of effort, especially on remembering things, because you're building a world that you are putting yourself in. You can't, like, you are trying to avoid contradicting yourself all the time, whether it's something like a concept you made, a part of mythology, a date in the timeline. You can't, the goal sometimes, unless you're really out there, is not to contradict yourself. It's so hard because I'll be writing about a certain culture group and then they're influenced by an event that happened, but then in the event that I wrote originally, that culture group is not there. I'll be like, oh, and it gives me a headache, and I'll be like, I have to like rewrite everything. And it's not fun all the time. World building is not fun. Because you're literally creating the history of your world. Yes. And you know how hard just our Earth's history is to even understand, not to create your own, it's sometimes a pain in the butt. Yeah. And I'm not the best world builder. I'm not like trying to say like, it's so hard, look how good I am. No, I'm trying to say like, it's so hard, I have struggled. Like it is not always fun. Now, with that warning out of the way, if you still want to do this, which I highly encourage you to do, you don't need a computer. You don't need a book to inspire you. You just need a piece of paper and maybe a pen, maybe some colored pencils or something. And then what I like to do is come up with a kingdom. That's like easiest thing to do. Make a flag, come up with some cool names that you think might fit this kingdom's culture, draw a castle, and then go from there. And then you start with the king, and then you go in the lineage. And then when you create a kingdom, obviously that kingdom is going to be affected by other people. So then start making them. And then where do they live? What's the geography like? So it really starts something really, really simple, like a really cliche fantasy trope, like a kingdom or a king, or a wizard or a princess or something like that, and go from there. And then take it just every day. And here's the thing I also told Caden, is when you're writing a novel, you will, and I can attest to this, I'm sure any listeners who write can as well. If you're writing a novel, you will have on and off days. Days where you're on fire and you wrote like 23 pages in one sitting, and then days where you can't even finish one sentence, where just nothing is, like writer's block. You just get writer's block. The good thing about world building is you can overcome that, because if you get writer's block about a certain part of your world, just write about another part of your world. Just move on to, like, oh man, like writing the history of this country is so hard right now. Okay, I'll write about the music of this country. What kind of musical instruments do they have? So you can just kind of like frog hop, just like from subject to subject, where like, oh, I really don't feel like about writing this today. Oh, I'll just write about this. So world building can be really hard, but it also, there are aspects where it's a lot easier than novel writing.
And I think that's a good note to end on.
Yeah.
So we hope that you enjoy this podcast. This series is going to continue. We're going to have lots to discuss, tons of good stuff.
And then next episode, I will interview Caden.
Okay, so
about
yeah,
his writing experience.
that will be an interesting one. So the idea we have when we're breaking up into these little mini series is just because we thought 4 people is pretty crowded.
Yeah,
So
it gets crowded.
we want to kind of discuss hobbies. So I think that these episodes will be a little bit shorter. Kind of get more to the point.
They're easier to make. So there'll be a lot more coming soon.
And a lot more content, a lot more ideas. And so we hope you guys had a good time. Please like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. From Caden and James, wish you guys a nice night.
All right, thanks for listening.
Bye.